I think it was called, I have to look at my notes here, Deranged. Oh no, it's Depraved. Deranged was on Albert Fish. Depraved, when I actually learned about H.H. Holmes' entire life, how he went to medical school, and how he did all these life insurance scams, and how he killed men, women, and children basically for money. All his crimes were financially motivated. And how he was his own attorney at his trial, and how he was married to 3 women at the same time, and he had all these mistresses. And I said, okay, now this is someone that's fascinating. He's not just some crazed, deranged killer. He's actually an evil genius. And we talk about Jack the Ripper, who had 5 victims, but think about it. Holmes may not have literally been America's first serial killer, but he's kind of America's first documented serial killer. That would have been a boring title for the movie, America's first documented serial killer. There were the Bloody Benders from Kansas. They disappeared though. So, can you really count them? But Holmes literally laid the groundwork for all of the other future serial killers to come. You could kind of look at him as the godfather of serial killers. So, when I read that book about H.H. Holmes, the next thing I did was try and look for a film, and nobody had ever made a film on this guy. And I'm like, wow, this is like a perfect horror film. Why haven't they done anything about it? And so I thought, okay, this was the perfect opportunity for me to make a film on H.H. Holmes, and that's what I did. We filmed some of the reenactments at Come Back In, which is gone, but it used to be in Melrose Park. It was this kind of down and dirty, restaurant, and they had, in the basement, they used to use it as a speakeasy. So we filmed the dungeon scenes in the basement there. So that's, there's a little bit of that background on it that, I kind of wanted to fill people in on. A couple days ago, I was talking to someone about my new film, and I'm doing a film on Gacy now, which is gonna premiere here next year. And they said, well, why now? Why make a film on Gacy? It's kind of ridiculous to do that. And I thought, well, why then is Gacy's sister writing a book? Why is Gacy's attorney coming out with a documentary? Why? Because we're all fascinated by this. Why is there another season of Mindhunter? We're all fascinated by serial killers. There are different levels. There are some people that just want to read about it and watch the shows, and there are others that collect the murderabilia. And think of the whole law enforcement system. They're fascinated by it as well. I know an ex-police officer who owns 3 original John Wayne Gacy paintings. And he was interviewed on my show, Serial Killer Culture TV. And it's funny when I ask him, what does your wife think of these? Oh, it doesn't bother her. I'm like, okay. So it's interesting when you look back on these stories. And Holmes' story is from the Victorian period. It's kind of this antiquated tale, long enough, further from our history than someone like John Wayne Gacy. But, I think people will forever be fascinated with the story of H.H. Holmes, trying to figure out why these women were so enamored by him, why he got away with so much. But it goes, the fascination even goes beyond that. There was the American Horror Story show, I'm sure you've all seen that. There was the hotel episode. They did a little nod to H.H. Holmes. Now, the whole history of this DiCaprio project is very interesting. Tom Cruise first bought the rights to Devil in the White City, the book, when it first came out. And then I went to an event at Indiana State University, and the screenwriter at the time was Christopher Kyle, who also did this movie K-19, The Widowmaker. And he said, oh yeah, we've got Holmes throwing bodies around the World's Fair. And my response was, well, Holmes wasn't that, he was much more intelligent than that. He wasn't sloppy to leave bodies around. So I think they're just having a problem figuring out how to tell the story, but it's all right there. So then after Cruise lost the rights to the book, then DiCaprio picked it up. Now he has the rights to it. Then it was going to be Paramount Pictures. Then the latest, now Scorsese's on board. Now the latest is it's going to be on Hulu. We're all still waiting for this film, and that's the latest I've heard about that. So I don't even know, if that's going to even ever come to fruition. But I was part of this show called American Ripper. I'm not sure if anyone saw it, and they talked about H.H. Holmes, maybe Jack the Ripper, and actually that whole show is total sensationalism. I told him I'll be on the show, but I'm not going to talk about his connection to the Ripper, and I'll talk about Holmes, the building, his mindset, his psychology. But now we've kind of, these TV shows understand the sensationalism of serial killers, whereas I usually stick to the truth and the true story and what I could prove by research. But they actually dug up H.H. Holmes from his grave in Yeadon, Pennsylvania, because, you know, they said, well, there was one story that it might not be him in that grave. I could have told him he was in that grave, but they dug it up for sensationalism. Now they're doing the same thing with John Dillinger. I just read about this a day or two in the news, that they're digging John Dillinger's body up because he might not be in that grave. Well, it's funny that it's the History Channel that also did the H.H. Holmes program. So, you know, I'm all about, you know, history and letting them lie, literally leaving it where it lies. You know, I'm selling a print of the Bean gravestone rubbing, you know, and that was stolen too, you know. So again, it all goes back to history, you know, history of the locations where these serial killers murdered, the history of forensics, the history of detective work. And that's what I ultimately intend to do with my documentary films, is to tell the truth and not sensationalize it. So, you know, I'm sure many of you have seen the film or know about H.H. Holmes, and you'll see how I just plainly tell the story. I don't take sides, and I just let the story talk for itself, basically. You know, and I'm glad everyone here has heard about H.H. Holmes, and you guys, I wanna, you know, I'm up here, so I wanna answer your questions. Any questions you might have about H.H. Holmes, you know, sometimes I get questions, well, you know, why didn't he ever kill any of his wives? He killed his mistresses for money or property, but he didn't kill any of his wives. My feeling is that he was such a forward thinker that he needed, everyone was pawns to him. Everyone was a pawn. So he needed someone to say something good about him if he was ever caught. Now, his wife that he set up in Wilmette in a nice house with their kid, is she gonna say anything bad about him? The first thing when the Chicago Tribune went to her house and said, well, what do you know about Holmes in the building? I don't know what he does at that building in Chicago. He's never harmed me or my child. So he had them as pawns too, and she didn't say anything bad about him. You know, and when Holmes was finally apprehended, it was for a life insurance scam. They had no idea that he was murdering. That's how good he was. And, you know, studying John Wayne Gacy's case, they're very much the same. Their business, their career of crime was cons and murdering. That was their life. That was their fun. You know, and I don't think H.H. Holmes may have even enjoyed it, because, again, everyone he saw was a price tag. He wanted to obliterate the entire Peitzel family and keep all that insurance money for himself. You know, he almost succeeded. He killed 3 of the children and the father, but he was going to kill the entire rest of the family as well. So, any questions while I'm up here before the movie starts? I know you guys must have questions.
Yeah, so lately, a lot of the tour guides and historians have been trying to downplay Holmes and saying, well, they only found so many bodies. He really did kill all these people. They just piled it on there so they could solve the case. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, we're talking about how many bodies, how many people did he actually kill? When you look at some of these, you know, books about H.H. Holmes, the further back you go, they try and make them extremely monstrous. He could have killed dozens, hundreds. You know, he was renting rooms and people were coming here to visit the World's Fair. Well, but then when you think about it, he had the 3 wives, he had his businesses, he had the building, he had all these things going on. In the end, we know for certain that he killed Benjamin Peitzel and 3 of the children. We know that, so that's 4. You know, Harold Schechter, who wrote the book on H.H. Holmes, says he could say 9. If you look at the women that disappeared, Holmes's mistresses, so in the end, I think it's probably between 9 and a dozen. You know, that's my opinion as far as how many kill count, you know, H.H. Holmes had. But it's interesting as you go back in time and then start coming forward, you see all these serial killers trying to one-up the last one. Well, now I'm gonna do a dozen. I'm gonna do 26. I'm gonna do, you know, hundreds. But, you know, how many of those could be verified? That's the difficult part. Like even with Albert Fish, you know, we know he killed Grace Budd. He confessed to that. He sent a letter to the little girl's mother 6 years after he killed her describing how he cooked and ate her. I mean, you know, think of how vile that is. But with him, we don't have proof that he killed more. So that's always the difficult part. When I made my film on Carl Panzram, he says he killed 21 people. And he says he killed all these Africans and fed them to crocodiles. Well, there's no proof. So I couldn't really say that in my film that, he did those things. He did kill the laundry foreman at Leavenworth. This is what we could prove. And again, with my documentaries, I say, here's what we can prove. There may have been more, we're just unsure. Any other questions? There must be a ton.
Yeah, the original movie was supposed to be the Down White City, but
Yeah, the movie was going to be Devil in White City, and supposedly they're still working towards that. But again, every year you hear something different.
Yeah.
Whether it's Paramount, Hulu, DiCaprio, I don't know. And is DiCaprio going to play? Yeah, it could be financing issues, And I always said that, with his story, you can't do one film. You'd have to do like a Lord of the Rings, like 3-hour movies. I mean, all the stuff this guy did, yeah, I fit a lot of it into an hour you're gonna watch here. But there's so much that he did, so many cons and scams and things he, actually got away with. And he just wanted to amass this, arrogance and his fortune. And, they never even said what happened to the money. Did it go to his wives? What happened to it eventually? But I think that was his enjoyment. Not just getting away with these scams and murders, but planning it. Like he knew when he met Benjamin Peitzel that he could use him one day when he needed him, and the time came, and he did it. He was a pawn, and he murdered him in that whole life insurance scam. So, there are a lot of unanswered questions like that as well, because when they're caught, they don't always tell the truth. You have people like Dahmer who sat down, and, there's an interview with him and his father where he tells the truth. Here's what I did. My book, he confesses. But then some, like Gacy, he first time initially, here's what I did. But then after that, no, it wasn't me. I don't know how those bodies got in my crawl space. I don't know. It's like, really, come on. But then here's the thing, they do a movie like the new Zac Efron Ted Bundy movie where you're not seeing him murdering. You could read Gacy's book. Gacy did write a book. You could read that, and if you didn't know anything about the crimes, he gives a convincing argument that he's innocent. Like if you read that, you'd say, this guy didn't do these things. Somebody else might have put those bodies in there. But then when you research it, start going back, you're like, how could that happen? It's impossible. There was another, yeah.
Do you think the advancement of forensic technology makes it harder for serial killers to have such a large, like when you have a Gacy, such a large kill count? Do you think that we're seeing less and less of that and more mass murders, like school shootings and things like that?
Yeah, it seems the serial killers have evolved or devolved, I don't know what we would call it, into these mass murderers. That's our newest, trend. Now it's mass murders and not serial killers. We may be creating future generations of serial killers now with what's going on in the world, who knows. But I think that, some of these serial killers, if they're highly intelligent, they may realize, okay, there's the computer, there's the internet, there are video cameras everywhere. How can I get away with this? And I think with advancements in technology, we're either not hearing about these serial killers now because maybe the media has realized, okay, you know what? We created these celebrities, serial killers. Maybe we should pull back a little and not publicize it as much. So they're still out there, and they may be revising their methods to get away with it based on our current technology. But of course, the further you go back, I think it was easier to get away with it. Because Holmes knew all the limitations of the time period, and he knew how to surpass them. He knew that if he went to Wisconsin or Indiana, he could be whoever he wanted, because at that time period, no driver license, no social security number, and he knew these limitations. And he took advantage of that time period. So, again, I think the further you go back, the worse they were, because they did get away with it due to the lack of forensics and detective work and video cameras and internet. So, we may be becoming more sophisticated in those crime detection techniques, but I also think that there are some that realize, these techniques and how to get away with them. There was a gentleman, I forget his name, but he was living in Alaska, and he would fly to different cities and states, commit murders there, and then go back to Alaska, because he knew, well, most serial killers operate close to home, they're gonna catch me, and then eventually they did catch him, but he would purposely go to different cities and states and bury his murder kits and then kill and then leave, so he would never be found. There's no evidence for him to take back with him. So I think that we might be seeing that now. I mean, some of them I do believe, like Dahmer or some of these other serial killers, they just did their thing. It was, you know, a compulsion and addiction. But then you have some, like BTK, Dennis Rader, who it was still an addiction and a compulsion, but he knew of all these other serial killers before him. So when my film on H.H. Holmes came out, that's when the BTK resurfaced. So I got a phone call from the Wichita police. I was a little scared. Wait, I didn't do anything. So then, you know, they said, we'd like to subpoena all your records of everyone in Wichita that bought your H.H. Holmes DVD, thinking that BTK, they knew he was fascinated by Holmes, that he may have bought the DVD. Well, he didn't, and then they said, well, we might have a screening to try and lure him out, because a lot of times these serial killers will revisit the scenes of their crimes, they'll go to the victims' funerals just to get a kick out of it. Well, they apprehended him before, but wouldn't that have been cool if my film helped catch BTK? That would have been awesome. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, yes.
Hey, John. A quick thing about Albert Fish. His lawyer said that before he was executed, he received a letter, and it was the worst thing he ever read, and that he would never make it public. Did he destroy it? Is there any mutterings of it ever showing up?
Yeah, I've never seen that. I mean, I've heard of it, but I've never seen that letter. I think it probably was destroyed. You know, Albert Fish to me was, you know, the worst ever, because not only did he murder and cannibalize little children, he was the original stranger danger. But he also committed all these acts upon himself. I mean, when he was apprehended, there were 29 needles that he had stuck in his body and his groin. You know, and, you know, I have a book on him as well, which are all his psychiatric files. And I think there's a mention in that book of that letter, but I think it was destroyed. You know, there are a lot of these, the further you go back to, it's harder to research these cases, because things are either lost, they're destroyed, or they're stolen, like Gein's headstone. People would steal these mugshots and all these documents, and they would sell them on eBay or sell them to the highest bidder or auction them off somewhere. So we see a lot of that, as well as these fake Gacy paintings. When my fourth film came out, Serial Killer Culture, there's a dealer in California, Hyena Gallery, he said, John, I had not seen so many fake Gacy paintings until your film came out. So every time there's this little rise in interest in these serial killers and their works, there's going to be people that take advantage of that, of course.
So there's been a lot of comparisons between male and female serial killers and their inspirations and what drives them to do what they do. I've read a couple comparisons between Bell Jonas and H.H. Holmes, and I was wondering what you thought about that. I mean, there are some overlaps on the surface, and also how do you decide what serial killer to really dig into when you're doing your documentary? So I know it's kind of a two-part.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, he mentioned Belle Gunnison, she was another serial killer, very similar to H.H. Holmes. You know, she was actually from Norway, but she was based in LaPorte, Indiana. So she was like a female H.H. Holmes. You know, she would get involved with men or marry them, murder them, and take their money or property and move on to the next one. So she was very much like H.H. Holmes, and again, one of these local legends and these legendary, you know, Midwest serial killers. It's always interesting that, why is it the Midwest and the West Coast? I don't know if it's the cold and the heat, but, you know, we have the worst serial killers. You know Dahmer and Gacy and Holmes and Gein and, you know, and the other question was, how do I choose, you know, who is going to be a subject of one of my films? Well, to me, I'm most fascinated by those extreme psychological cases. Now, it's nothing against the victims, but, you know, if there's, you know, like, for instance, like a Keith Jesperson or a Green River killer who's picking up prostitutes and throwing them at the side of the road, to me, it's not as fascinating as an elderly man who's eating little children and has all these, you know, needles in his body. You know, to me, I want to hear about those extreme cases, and that's just what fascinates me. And then when I hear, like many people, when I hear about these extreme cases, then I want to study them, go into their psychology, and then, you know, when I make the film, it's interviewing forensic psychologists, looking at the history, the time period they lived in. So I really put their life under a microscope and study every little aspect. You know, like I want to know the name of their dog, how many chairs they had in their living room. You know, because I want to know, I seriously want to know it all, because you have a lot of people that say, oh yeah, I know these things, but they're reading a Wikipedia page. I'm going to read every book, and I look into pop culture. You know, was there ever a song made on them? You know, album covers. It's pretty thorough usually.
On Jeffrey Dahmer, there's a couple of arrests where he exposed himself to women and children, which doesn't make sense. Do you think he was trying to get caught to get himself off the street, or?
That's a good question. You know, he mentioned that, you know, Dahmer may have wanted to be caught. And I think, you know, talking to several people today and doing further research on the Gacy case, I think Dennis Rader, BTK, and Gacy wanted to be caught. They didn't want to turn themselves in, but they wanted to be caught. Because why was Gacy's last victim so different than all of his other victims? You know, this was a white kid from the suburb. He was a hustler on the streets of Chicago, a drifter. You know, and it was almost as if Gacy was crying out to be caught, and that's how he was apprehended eventually. And the same thing for Dennis Rader. I mean, you know, do we truly believe that Dennis Rader, I believe he did this. You know, he worked on a computer in the Lutheran church, and he was going to send the police a floppy disk, but he asks them ahead of time, can you pull evidence from a floppy disk? And they tell him no. Now, come on now. I mean, really? We would know that we could do that. So it was almost, he wanted to be caught. Because why are you going to do that and then say, oh, you guys lied? Well, come on, of course they're going to lie to you. And then he's upset because he's lied to his wife. You know, it's always, everyone's got a finger point. You know, it's never their fault. You know, it's always someone else. BTK's daughter wrote a book, you know, and that's fascinating as well. You know, now I believe Gacy's daughter's writing a book as well that's coming out soon. Any other questions?
During your research, and for a lot of them, they do actually still have family, children, wives, ex-wives, parents even in some cases. So like, how cooperative are they normally when you're doing research? Do you find you're getting a lot of like, we changed our name, we don't want to be associated, or are they wanting to share the story of what they knew that person would be like if it was their dad or,
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, we talk about the families of these killers, whether they're their children or their wives or siblings or family. Many times they don't want to be hounded by the press. They'll move far away and they change their names. Usually that's what happens, at least until they may want some money, right? And then they come out with a book, or something else. But usually they don't want to be. And my case, usually I focus on pre-1940 cases, so there's, there might be some of their descendants around. I have been emailed by, people. It was very interesting when I was doing Holmes, when I first released it on DVD, self-distributed first, and then I had a distributor. But when I first self-distributed it, I was getting checks purchasing the DVD from the Mudgetts and the Peitzels, the victims and the murderers' families. It was just weird. But then again, some may say because they're older, like if it's an old case like Holmes, they may say, yeah, hey, we're descendants, this is kind of interesting, but I think the more current and more modern you get, I could understand, if it was their own children or brother or cousin, so that's why I approach it with care now, especially like the Gacy film, I'm gonna do one on Dahmer as well, and you just have to be very careful and respectful because usually they don't want to be a part of it. Because they've been hounded by the press and they just don't want the vultures being around. I mean, there's Mary Bell, she was a little girl in the UK that murdered other little kids when she was a kid. And, she went into hiding because she was set free after a while and she's still, she's still free. But she's, in hiding. The press did find out where she lived at one point and hounded her, but then she had to go underground again and hide again. And, So, that could be a difficult part, but again, I always say I like doing very early serial killers because they're dead, they can't complain. Nobody could, come after me. So it's like, I'd rather focus on those. But, being from Chicago myself, I thought it was important to do a film on Gacy, but make it very Chicago-centric. What about the police here? Why, what happened? Why weren't they taking some of these, the victims that lived, why weren't they taking their accusations of Gacy seriously, and what happened? What is the truth? What was going around at the time period? So, I'm trying to focus a little bit more now on the Midwest serial killers like Gacy, Gein, and Dahmer, and those are gonna be up next. Is there another question?
I know you're an independent filmmaker. What does it take to put this all together by yourself?
Yeah, and that's another great question. Holmes, I initially did 100% independently. And I still do them that way, but now obviously they have these Kickstarters, there are fundraisers, there are some other ways to bring in money to fund these projects, but it's very difficult. It's piecing it together, help from friends. When I did H.H. Holmes, I had shot the film 100% independently, but then I knew I needed more. I knew the film looked good, but I needed good sound design, I needed a great narrator, I needed a great composer. So I was lucky enough, and obviously, you could see my talent on the screen, but I got involved with the composer of the music of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, so he did the score. Tony Jay is the narrator, who know him from Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was the villain, Judge Frollo. He was the voice of the Asylum Keeper in Beauty and the Beast. And he'd been around, he was in the Star Trek Next Generation show. So again, I knew at some point I had to bring that up, a notch. And I always try to get some sort of a named narrator or a voiceover artist, like John DiMaggio, who was Bender the Robot in Futurama. He was the voice of Panzram for my third film. And it's always, I always like that too, because when you're there with them in the, voiceover room, they do all these other voices, and that's always pretty cool. But you're right, it's very difficult, doing it 100% independently. But I fear getting into bed with some of these larger companies, because when you do that, then it's their perspective. Then they're gonna tell you what to do. Oh, you know what, at 15 minutes, you gotta have this in there to get people excited. There was one TV show on, I think it was Richard Chase, who was a serial killer, and he would drink his victim's blood, but that's all they talked about, the sensationalism aspect of it. They never focused on him being a schizophrenic. So for me, it's like, I wanna know the how, where's, and whys of their stories. But piecing it together is very difficult. So right now there's a GoFundMe going on that's for my next 4 films, and it's ongoing. But the first one is Gacy. We've begun shooting it, and we're gonna continue on that route. I think that's it, maybe one more? Anyone else, one more question? All right, well, enjoy the 15th anniversary of H.H. Holmes. I'm gonna be here tomorrow as well. I have a booth, stop by, say hello, we can talk serial killers, and enjoy the film. Thank you, everybody, for coming.